All right. Primero, overview. I'm going to give you an introduction to my research in the area of health and wellness, and I'm going to argue that computing systems can address fundamental problems in chronic care management. More than that, I'm going to talk to you about the theories that drive my research. And I'm going to discuss the present and future of AI that's really central to my research agenda. And of course, lessons I've learned along the way. Primeramente, right? Soy una embajadora de Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech y el Colegio de Computación, estamos reinados 5 o 6, me acuerdo de doctorado. We have 2 PhDs, uno que es CS PhD y otro que es HCC PhD, que es Human Centered Computing. The College of Engineering is also ranked in the top 5, and I hope that you'll consider, Georgia Tech for an MS or a PhD or maybe even a postdoc. So, as Monica said, I'm trained as a psychologist. I study human thoughts, perception, and behavior. And of course, when you're a psychologist, you always wear on your sleeve that you're also a scientist. And so as a psychologist, I thought about science and how do we do science? That is, how do we make observations? How do we make predictions? How do we test predictions? And of course, there's a whole realm of psychology that really wants to intervene to improve the human condition. And being a psychologist means that you're really tethered to theories. What are those principles that organize what we see and what we propose? Now, for the past 15 years, I've been an HCI researcher, right? We study how people interact with computers. We design systems that are useful and usable. Some people say they should also be enjoyable. That's up for grabs. Mm-hmm. And the most important part of being an HCI researcher is that we have to allow the user to meet their goals. And again, at Georgia Tech, I'm also affiliated with human-centered computing. And the idea here is that in human-centered computing, we really move beyond the dyad of human and computer to a broader understanding of how computational artifacts affect and transform human experience and culture. And so, of course, the focus has to be on these socio-technical systems. So I told you when I was a psychologist, I use a scientific method. In my life as an HCI researcher, I use user-centered design. What do we do in user-centered design? We assess the systems, we contextualize them, we think about different ways of doing them, we think about prototyping and then evaluating those prototypes. And in HCI, right, and I initially came into HCI from UBAComp. You could think about the contributions in UBAComp. All the contributions are near future. But in fact, I'm very drawn to the pragmatic aspect of computer science. Right? So how do I build pragmatic interactions? How do I use these interfaces? How do I develop these systems, once again, to meet the goal of the user? So really, for me, psychology and HCI meet in health and wellness. This idea that when you have these computational systems, you scale human over time and space. As a psychologist, as an endocrinologist, as a podiatrist, you can only meet one patient. But really, if we build the right computational system, we can really scale that effort. And a lot of what I've done in my work is really think about what are those theories in psychology and social sciences that can really move my research forward as an HCI researcher. So for me, really improving the human condition is at the center of the health research that I do. I looked up the numbers for Mexico and they're just as bad, unfortunately, right? The US is spending almost 20% of the GDP in health. And we have some of the most unhealthiest people in the world. So how can that be? And these numbers are very similar to the numbers I found in Mexico, which is basically that 7 out of 10 deaths each year actually have to do with these behavioral issues that we could mitigate. So for me, when I think about human-centered computing and how it can improve the human condition, I really think that the systems I build have to have evidence from both science and design. To me, it's not enough to design a system that's useful and usable and enjoyable if it's actually not going to make people better. All right, so I'm going to start by defining chronic condition. This is a condition that has to last for more than 1 year. It has to lead to limitations in function, activity, or social role. There must be some dependency on medication or require some medical, educational, or psychological services beyond what is expected of an age mate. And so today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about work that I've done in pediatric asthma. That's the most mature research. I'm going to talk to you about PTSD work that I'm doing now, and I'm going to talk to you about some of the newest work that I'm doing on diabetes. So again, I design technologies that bridge major gaps in chronic care management and improve health and wellness. How do we engage the user? What are the current treatment practices? Once again, I'm going to work in the context that the doctor is working in. Why? Because one of the hardest things to do is to change the health services workflow. I want to be able to work in that workflow. How do I bridge the gap in continuity of care? We've all been to the doctor. The doctor says, "How are you?" And you say, "I'm fine." You forget that you had, a migraine that lasted for a month, or that you had a hip. As you get older, you had some hip ache that went away. So how is it that we can collect that data to understand what that health condition has been over periods of time, especially at that point of care? Now you're at the doctor. How can I take that technology that's collecting data to be able to mediate communication at point of care? This is incredibly important, maybe in Mexico, but in the U.S. we know that people of color, right, people that aren't, white, middle class, are going to get attention that's different than poor people. We know that, they don't listen. They don't think that the pain that, for example, black women feel is the same as the pain that white women feel. That's why we have some of the worst maternal mortality rate, in the world. That's very pathetic. So, what would you want the care provider to know? How do we build these systems so that we start to drive self-advocacy? And so again, I'm going to talk to you about asthma. I'm going to talk to you about about PTSD. I'm going to talk to you about diabetic foot, but they all have these three. All the systems I have these three things in common. How can I engage patients? How can I improve or bridge the gap in continuity of care? And how do I mediate communication when I'm there with the doctor? Because I'm an HCI and HCC researcher, I design systems that support a variety of stakeholders. And, collaboration is key. I always tell my students, on a good day, I'm a computer scientist, but I'm never going to be an anesthesiologist, a podiatrist, an endocrinologist. So there, it's going to be really important to have those domain experts, something that Monica has made a career of doing, and of course, Favela too. Right? Why? Because these domain experts are going to understand the gold standard of care. What do they use in their practice? And then, of course, I'm going to use my design expertise to judge if it works. Is it useful and usable? And so over the years, I've done a lot of work with the Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, a lot of work with local hospitals, also a lot of work with the CDC. One of your graduates, Lisbeth, has done some of this work with me looking at milestone tracking. We developed the first CDC app for milestone tracking that was also downloaded over 700 or 800,000 times in the 3 years. So now I'm going to move to the kind of the center of what I do. So how do we move beyond this user-centered approach? How do I leverage theories to drive the design work? And so I'm going to talk to you about a health belief model that comes out of epidemiology and an ecological system theory that comes out of developmental psychology. All right, so I'm going to briefly go over pediatric asthma. It's the most common chronic disease among children, and the gold standard of care is really going to be a medication regimen. So there, if you have this idea that you want children to take their medicine, then how can we improve that? And so this was some of the, some of the earliest work. It turns out that children still prefer texting, even, 15 years after this original work. So, you say, well, what technology do these kids use? They still use text, right? And then we say, well, how do we design a system to improve health outcomes? And to me, that's the idea of this user-centered design. And then, of course, because I'm a scientist, it's not enough for me that I deploy a system, but that I want to know, did my system cause, right, that effect? And in order to do that, we're going to have to do a random control trial. And so the health belief model really is from Erwin Rosenstock and really talks about what are those cognitive variables that affect behavior change. And so the idea is that you have these modifying factors, like somebody's age, their gender, their ethnicity, their socioeconomic status, and knowledge. That's going to affect the people's individual beliefs about their ability to change their care. There's the perceived severity of the disease, the perceived benefit of engaging in the particular health regimen, and the perceived barriers. Again, if we have people that have to make a choice between buying medicine and buying food for their kids, we know what's going to happen. All right, but let's imagine that that's not the case. So I work with the kind of the easiest of these. That is, how do we help people understand the severity of their disease? Right? A lot of the things that we find in chronic care is that people don't think they're sick. People would be the respiratory therapist would say they're with the person, and this is not just children, this is older adults with COPD. And the person is talking like this because they can't catch their breath. And yet, they don't have a problem. It's not severe because you get used to it. So how do we move severity of disease, the perception of severity of disease? How do we improve asthma knowledge? And I always say that knowledge is not enough, right? I know that I shouldn't have the second enchilada, but I love it, so I'm going to eat it. So how do we work with those two points of evidence? And so this is a study I did with my first PhD student. So the idea is, how can SMS interventions based on the health belief model improve health outcomes? Is it useful? Can we prove it? Will patients engage with the system between medical appointments? Right, that's a continuity of care. Is it usable? Will they keep using it? It was a very simple little experiment. We had a group of kids that were randomly assigned to get a text message where we would check, right, about their symptoms, getting them to think about the severity of their illness. In the past 4 weeks, did you wake up at night wheezing or coughing? Just a single text message, N or Y. And then some children would get both. One day they would get a symptom question. The other day they'd get knowledge question. Everyone's asthma is the same, true or false, and then we give them a factoid. Of course, this was this was deployed in a real-world setting where people would come in for their first visit. We'd give them the text messaging system, and then it'd follow up over 3 or 4 months. The doctor, right? The health informatics part was that all the SMS data would come to the doctor, and the doctor would be allowed to check what are the symptoms they're giving us. So again, that continuity of care. We're trying to engage the patients, send them something. We're trying to check that continuity of care over the 3 months. What were the responses? We made it easy for the doctors to get their nurse to act in a certain way, to send information if the children were saying that they were in the red zone. The idea was that Sometimes the children didn't have the right knowledge about asthma. So once again, at the point of care, the doctor could say, you thought everybody's asthma is the same. Well, actually, and so how do we help that these prompts mitigate the communication at point of care? And so the long story short is that we found that in, a series of actually 3 random control trials, children that had text messages daily had improved lung function. And the lung function was both statistically significant and also, it was also a difference in wellness. So the doctors would say this change in lung health actually means that the child is better. And we actually found, this is not in here because I want to hurry up, but we actually found that children that were more sick, when we did this with children that had public insurance, even a single text message every other day improved their lung function. So again, if we just to summarize, right, there's accountability here. We understood that patients' lung function improved in a statistically and in a significant manner, right? We had, if we come back to the theory, right, the theory was that the symptoms, if we tell you about your symptoms, you're going to use the actual, you're going to take your medicine. But we actually found that there were 2 profiles. There were some children, and this is why you do mixed methods approach, right? If we had just done the quantitative study, we would have said, hey, it worked. It's, it's the health belief model. But we actually found that there was 2 ways that children were using this. Some of this was actually supported by the health belief model. They said, oh my God, I am sick. I better take my meds. But there was a second group of kids that said, I'm going to get the text message anyway. I'm going to set it as a reminder. I can get my text message, I can take my medicine. So again, these were very different ways that you were getting the same result. Design accountability, it was usable. Patients were willing to give us text messages, even though they said it was very boring, right? The same messages for 3 months, but they still did it. We had over 91% response rate. So now the part of my talk is I'm supposed to tell you about all the great things that I do with AI. Well, no, it didn't happen. But this is just to remind you that great work happens even without AI. It happened in the past. It happened in the future. Don't worry about the LLMs. You don't have to do that work, right? So be free to be yourself as a researcher. So again, the lesson here is that good research happens before AI and after AI, but also that, had we had that system now, we could use AI to give those prompts that were more meaningful, to make them more interesting. All right, so next I'm going to talk to you about post-traumatic stress disorder. And so here I'm going to move to the next theory that's really impacts the way I think about computational systems. And this is the ecological system theory by Yuri Bronfenbrenner. And here we talk about how technology is situated in an individual's life. And so here you have Yuri Bronfenbrenner, of course, because he was a psychologist. He has a super interesting model where you have time, you have, the microsystem, the mesosystem, the exosystem, right? All these words, and you're like, what does it mean? But basically the idea is that development, right, is defined over time, but also it is a psychosocial system that it really has to do with how people interact in different settings. And the degree to which individuals alter each other. So the systems that we build, those computing systems, those, wearables, it's not just about the work that Gloria was telling us about, the child and the technology, but the teacher and the technology, and the student and the parents and the technology. So how is it contextualized? And so with my second PhD student, we wrote a paper where we talked about how is it that we can use this ecological systems theory to think more broadly about how we design our technology. The idea is that we can use, as designers, the power of this ecological approach is that it provides a framework to define the settings. It reminds the designer about the user's entire ecosystem. It's not just about the child with asthma. First, as a psychologist, you would never say culture because culture is so broad, but we say, what's that environment? But really, you can read it as, what is that cultural experience that people are having? And then, once again, the idea is that in using this ecological theory, it helps us conceptualize how technology can be situated in these settings. Again, it helps the designer understand where can we target technology. And so it's going to be like an explosion of technology. Over the years, we did asthma, right? We did technology that was just for the child, which was that text messaging system. We built some that helped knowledge, in the home. We had some where people could play it in school. The last paper that we wrote was looking at improving asthma knowledge in the emergency department. But now we come back to PTSD. So again, now we're using the same system with adults. And so PTSD is a trauma and stressor-related disorder. It has these 4 components. Trauma re-experiencing. Of course, people have these memories or these intrusive nightmares of the traumatic event. And by the way, PTSD is not just bad things that happen to you, but if you witness them, it's avoidance of the trauma-related situations, thoughts, and feelings. It's the negative alteration moods and a kind of hyperarousal. In the U.S., 20% of veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan conflict actually come back. And, in HCI, right, in psychology, you would be happy to have all those statistics. But in HCI, we learn that it's not just about the numbers, but it's about the individual. So, here we look with this Army veteran that says, I'm left with basically nothing. Too trapped in war to be at peace, and too damaged to be at war. So really, you're in the middle of nowhere. So we talked about that gold standard of care. The gold standard of care for PTSD is called prolonged exposure. People can recover from PTSD. You don't have to live with it. And here, the idea is that the clinician, right, the psychotherapist, is going to teach the individual to gradually approach their trauma-related memories, feelings, and situations. I often think about if you have a glass of water and you put a piece of dye, you put a drop of dye, it hits that initial spot and then it diffuses. And that's exactly what happens with PTSD. There's this terrible thing that happens, but then you associate it with everything else. It becomes very distributed and really confining. I mean, it's really incredible. Anyway, so we work with Emory. They have a veterans program where veterans come for 10 days. These people are so incapacitated, they'll come to Atlanta for 10 days to get this daily treatment from Monday to Friday. And the idea is that these veterans are going to learn how to communicate, right, this level of trauma-related memories, feelings, and sensations. And again, as a psychologist, right, how can we quantitate that? How do we make that quantitative? We have something that's called a subjective unit of distress. So if you tell me, I'm really stressed, I say, okay, on a scale of 0 to 100, where 0 is you're not stressed at all, and 100 is like somebody is attacking you again, where are you? So we're giving them an anchor. That's called the subjective unit of distress. That's going to be really important when we talk about the machines. All right, so during the clinical session, right, the doctor and the patient will talk about the terrible thing that happened to them. And the doctor is literally every 5 minutes, they're going to say, what's your SUD? What's your SUD? It's 100, it's 95, it's 90, right? And then the interesting thing about this therapy, it's a cognitive behavior therapy, is that they have to do homework. There's 2 homeworks they have to do. They every night they're going to, so in the day they go to the doctor and they talk about this terrible thing that happened to them, okay? And this is audio tape. In the night, their homework is super easy. All you have to do is go home and put on your earphones and listen to yourself recount the scenario. Okay? And then you have to write down your SUDs. What was your SUD? And then the second part is, once again, the behavior. They have to go out and literally stress themselves a little at a time. Right? And so this is called in vivo because they're out in the world. And, the idea is, I always say that the cognitive profile, right? We're talking about people that are neurodivergent because of their condition, right? At this point, if I ask you tomorrow, the thing about psychology is that it hasn't changed in 150 years. It's still self-report and clinician intuition. Did you do your homework? Yes, I did. I wonder if he did his homework or she did her homework. So how do we move beyond that? So here's an example. This is not a real example, but it really is a scenario where this military person goes out and they're attacked. They come under enemy attack. They try to escape from the attack and they end up running over a lot of children. Okay? So now the person is obviously traumatized. So then we talked about that subjective units of distress, just to tell you that hierarchy. The first thing we're going to do is, what's the least stressful thing you can think of? Well, I can go to a park where there's kids, but it has to be really early in the morning, so I won't see any children. Right? So every day, the patient is going to do homework that's a little more stressful, according to the subjective unit of distress. So I told you it's the greatest therapy ever, but it's very hard to deliver. Again, we have this reliance on self-report, and it's very hard to collect. Right? I talk about continuity of care, but how is the doctor going to do that in your normal circumstances? It relies on clinician intuition, right? There's limited decision support tools to promote guidance of proper therapy practice. And again, there's this lack of objective information to tell us what are the aspects of prolonged exposure therapy that's working the best, and how do we optimize that? And so this is work that is supported by the NSF. And so here we were making inroads in 3 different areas, right? So we developed a ubiquitous computing system that gathers all the data. We have a whole section that really is about how do we actually build these interfaces so that they're useful and usable. And of course, you can't get a grant these days without having some machine learning. So the idea was, how can we predict the clinical factors that lead to individual recovery? So once again, you're going to see that, that Bronfenbrenner ecological system. So the idea was that we can build the system that has to be necessarily at the level of the patient and the doctor. We have to be able to think about, well, what about the fact that if you think about the cognitive profile of a soldier, right, the kind of masculinity, what you need to succeed in therapy is exactly juxtaposed to what it is to be a soldier, to be self-reliant, right, to be vulnerable. That's not in their playhouse. So then how might we be able to use their friends and family to help the clinician understand how is that therapy actually working? How do we use the language inside of the therapeutic session to be able to help novice clinicians improve their delivery? And then, of course, because I told you that PTSD has an arousal component, we use very off-the-shelf, we use a Fitbit while they're doing their therapy, and then we monitor all of the activity on their phone. So again, this is something that we deploy. So we have the patient app, and the idea is that when the patient starts their in vivo therapy or their imaginal, either one, they turn on the app. We're able to collect the data, right? We're also collecting, again, we talked about the self-report. Did you do it for half an hour? We talked about patient engagement. Now we can talk about patient engagement as engagement minus distractions. So if you're engaged, you're going to be paying attention, you're going to be sitting there for 30 minutes. But if you're distracted, right, what happens when you're nervous? You turn on your phone, right? Some of the research that you're doing now. You turn on your phone, you listen to a podcast, you do something else. Or even here, right, we have the Bodyscape, which is a Fitbit. Some of the things that the clinicians say is that the patient will actually get drunk and then do their exercise. Because they don't want to feel it, right? So now we have the physiological data If everything else is working, but their physiology didn't change, then we can say, that's interesting, what happened? And again, the idea is that we're not building systems to catch the veteran. We're building systems to promote this point of care interaction. Now the clinician can use this data as prompts. Next time, you were there only 15 minutes, or you were told to go to the grocery store, but not at 3 a.m. when there's nobody else there, right? So how do we get that data to improve that point of care interaction? All right, so over the course of these 4 years, again, we've tried to understand the veterans' ecology of care, right? We did semi-structured interviews with clinicians, civilians, and veterans to find out what are those tools that patients need, what are those experiences that families have had so that we can start to understand how to build the system. We published another paper at CAI where we take this idea of a trusted informant. Under what conditions would you let your family or friends provide information to a care provider? Now, again, as a psychologist, right, and you all know that, who are the people that are in these studies? There are people that are motivated to come, people that have cars to get to Georgia Tech, or people that believe in science. How do we actually know what people need? So I've been doing studies on Reddit, right? This is a social forum, because what we want to know in order to build these systems, we want to be able to triangulate on what is it that real veterans actually need, not just the one that seek care. Because at the end of this day, if we want to build systems that are useful and usable, we need to know what people are what they actually want. And so, that's one of the reasons why I do these social computing studies. Now, this idea of how is it that we can start to transform PTSD therapy with these machines. All right, well, I told you that we're going to be collecting the phone data. We're going to collect the data that happens between the patient and the caregiver. We have the Fitbit data. We have the data from the patients. And the question is here, right? Remember I told you every 5 minutes or some number of times during the therapy, people are going to give us their subjective units of distress. Now what we want to know is, can the machine start to predict what the patient is going to say? So the idea is we collect all the data on Monday, and then on Tuesday, the machine predicts this is what the patient is going to do. And so the idea is that using those predicted units of distress, we can start to understand what the individual clinical journey is of an individual. We can start to make predictions about, if now I have a group of 50 veterans, what is the average trajectory? And this is important because there might be people that recover in a week, so let them go home, right? And there might be people that need to be there 3 weeks. So how can we make these systems more efficient? And then, overall, now we have not just the patient data, but we also have the clinician data. Maybe there's clinicians that work better with certain types of trauma, right? When we did the ecologies of care paper, one of the biggest reasons why people drop out is because they didn't have a match. They didn't feel an affinity with their clinician. If you don't feel an affinity with your clinician, you're going to drop out. So how can we learn what doctor works with better trauma so that people stay in the system? So, again, we want to be able to use these systems to really facilitate the delivery and effectiveness of PE. But of course, you can't do one of these studies without talking about large language models. Sorry. All right, so last summer, we published a paper in ICML, and we coined a phrase of the Turing experiment, right? So everybody knows the Turing test. The Turing test is, can you tell that this is a machine? Now, everybody is simulating data. So the Turing experiment is, given a set of data, can you tell that that it's a machine, that it's simulated data versus human data. And so in the paper, we looked at a variety of psychometrics that we did, psycholinguistics, we did garden path, we did the Milgram experiment, we did behavioral economics. And so the idea is, now that everybody's starting to use this data to simulate behavior, how do we start checking that it's actually valid? And so when we think about facilitating PE delivery, we know who are the people in the US that come to therapy, people that have money, right? People that have a certain educational level, and these things are very correlated with kind of European American. So what happens, the people that are trained only have a certain type of experience. And so one of the things that my new student is doing is we're saying, can we use large language models to simulate human patients? So now can we build a person with PTSD? But now we have to be careful, we have to do it ethically. So the first thing we're doing is, first of all, as we know, the data where these large language models are built, they are based on information people might have about PTSD. So the first thing we do is we compare the symptoms that these large language models report compared to the American Psychological Diagnostic. So what's the actual criteria, right? So that now you can actually temper those models. Next, we know that there are biases in the system. So once again, how do we understand what those biases are as part of patient representation? We know, for example, that in the US, if you say PTSD, people are going to think white, combat veteran. But in fact, that's not the case. Most people with PTSD, most men with PTSD, is not about combat. It's probably about violence. Same thing with women. It's not going to be sexual assault, maybe some other kind of violence. So how do we start to understand what kind of bias are in that representation to build valid simulations? And then finally, how do we get authentic narratives? And so one of the things that we've done is we have the PTSD subreddit, right? People go there to talk about their trauma. And the idea is that we can use these voices, right? First of all, to come up with authentic narratives. Not everything is about combat or about sexual trauma. And then to build authentic voices. How is it that people talk about their condition? What they say and how they say it. All right. So once again, we talk about patient engagement, right? Continuity of care, point of care interaction. And so now, right, I've told you about pediatric asthma, I've told you about PTSD, and now this is new work that I'm doing on diabetic foot ulcers. So diabetes, of course, is terrible, as terrible as it is here. 10% of, 1 in 10 people are diagnosed with PTSD in the US. 1 in 3 are pre-diabetic. Terrible. And the fact is that about a third of people with diabetes are going to get foot ulcers, right, on the bottom of their feet or around their foot. And these things will recur. And about 20% of people that get a recurring ulcer will actually have to have an amputation. And within this, the mortality rate after amputation is about 70% 5 years out. And of course, in the US, there's people that say, well, people get what they deserve. Too bad they didn't take care of themselves. Well, but if you want to just think about it from the cold hard cash, it's $109 billion a year, only for diabetic foot ulcers. So even if you don't care about people suffering, then maybe I can help motivate people through their the economic burden. Once again, I told you I looked at the gold standard of care, whether it's a prescription medicine, whether it's a therapeutic therapy, and now we have something podiatrist. I just learned learn a new word, right? When you go to the podiatrist, they're going to check 4 things. They're going to check your grandmother's skin. They're going to check the blood circulation. So if you didn't know, if you press your finger, the amount of time that it takes to go from white to red, that's a measure of your blood circulation. And the doctor will say, if it's 3 seconds or less, you're healthy. If it's 3 seconds or more, we have a problem. Next, we're going to have sensation. So usually they'll have a filament, and basically they'll say, can you say, because one of the problems with diabetic foot ulcers is that you have neuropathy, you have nerve death. And so people will come in with huge holes in their feet and they never felt it. And then when the doctor is walking the patient in, they'll check their gait. If people have deformities in their walk, it can give us indications of that. So, right, so in your mind, start to think, what technology would you use if you said you have, what does your grandmother's foot like? What would you do? Okay? Una foto. Right. Take a photo of your grandmother's foot. What if you wanted to do the CRT? The doctor wants to know what's her circulation. What would you do?
And the
What?
the big foot.
The big foot, you do in the big toe. How do you give that information to the doctor?
You do?
On your phone.
You do?
Exactly. We have a video. What if you want to know if the patient can feel their foot? What would you do? The motor. You use the motor on the phone, right? And then gait, you just use the motors on the phone, and we do a 1 minute gait walk. So we have a patient and clinician app. We call it Diabetic Ulcer Computational Sensing System, DUCS. And so we have, in the app, you get, we tell people to take a picture. We get some self-report. Right? We want to know if there's infection. Is the area hot? Is the area, is it swollen? Is there stuff coming out of it? Right? Is it supuración, right? That's a weird word. With these kinds of Likert scales, is there a new wound? So now you can imagine what the machines are doing, right? The machines are going to check, is this a new wound or an old wound? Is it getting bigger or smaller, right? Is there a correlation to the amount of redness and what we can perceive? We, of course, use video for the CRT. We actually use the vibration on the phone. But, of course, we have the same problem that Luis was telling us, which is if you touch the phone, you have the texture of the phone. So how do we know what how do we test that? So we have a 5-point touching system, and it only vibrates, 3 to 5 times. So then we say, how much time did you feel a vibration? So the kind of finer sensation. And we do the gait measurement for a minute or two. And so once again, right, we're going to talk about that ecological system. We're talking about your grandmother. What good, maybe your grandmother is very flexible and, and very fit, but what good would it be for me to build an app for your grandmother? It doesn't make sense. But I can know when you go visit, if you sign up, I will know that you've gone to visit your grandmother, and I can send you a text message to say, hey, get some data from her feet, right? It's also a very intimate thing, so who's going to want to touch your grandmother's feet? Probably you. So how do we work with that ecology? Then how do we build these simple interfaces to know is your foot getting better or worse? We have the text messaging app, and then of course, it's also about the ethics, right? We know that all the computer vision algorithms are, on white skin. So how do we use all this data to build algorithms for dark skin? And, just to give you a sense of how skewed, these systems are, we now have 180 dark skin individuals, and we now have the largest data set in the world. That's pathetic, right? So, again, there's a lot of human suffering. We're in the part where you have to annotate these data, right? What is an actual ulcer? What is an actual point of interest in the skin? Is not really an ulcer. So that means that all of that data, we had to get it annotated. We have to have a podiatrist that validates it, right? We talk about simulation, it's never going to work, but basically how do we take 4 static images and make it a 3D rendering? And that, of course, is simulation. It's never going to work, I'm not going to even try. But again, you know, the idea is that we can take, the reason I call it ducks instead of pets, is that we basically take the same computational system and now use it to capture other aspects of it. All right, so just to recap, I've given you examples of my research at the intersection of science and design. I've told you about asthma and how you can build simple systems that improve self-care, that lead to improvement in health outcomes. I've told you about the prolonged exposure of continuous sensing system for PTSD and how we're moving towards improving patient practice and clinician delivery. And then I've told you about ducks. That is, you know, a really new area. I'm really happy we, you know, as Monica told you, we just got some funding that'll, you know, keep us busy for 3 years. We have our first paper out if you're interested in machine learning for diabetic ulcers. Mm-hmm. And now I want to tell you a little bit about, you know, what are the lessons that we've learned? How do we take advantage of having theory influence technology design, right? Well, first, I told you that when you build systems based on theories, then they're inherently generalizable. That is, the health belief model, right, is not about asthma or diabetes or other conditions. And so, in fact, even though we started with asthma, I've told you how we can use this across the way. We've used it not only with asthma and diabetes, but also with congenital heart. And, you know, one of the things that I always talk about being, you know, a scientist is that replication is very important because it's not enough that we showed that it worked in one group of kids. We also showed that it worked in kids, whether they're rich or whether they're poor. We showed that it works in kids that have asthma and have diabetes. And then we showed that it didn't work in adults that have congenital heart disease. Why is it? We found that not only did it not improve their health, their prescription, but actually they were very nervous. Why? Because people that are 50-year-olds with congenital heart disease, the only thing that they have left is a heart transplant. And being reminded every day about their symptoms just stressed them out. Mm-hmm. So again, what are the limitations of those systems that we're building? We always export to the world. And in fact, it's not possible for one system to do everything. Again, the design implications are also transferable that we can talk about. What does it mean for you to build this this ecosystem for children with asthma, for children with adults with PTSD? We also have a series of studies where we think about, well, what happens if the artifact is the focus of the ecology? Right? And so we did a number of studies looking at personal protective equipment during COVID and how the ecosystem, you know, built across this. And, you know, the other things we've learned along the way is that when we build these ecological systems, then, you know, the caregiver really changes. The caregiver, we only don't have to think about the doctor and the patient, right? We can start thinking about you and your grandmother as a clinical caregiver. And the other thing is we start to leverage technology at the society level. So now we think about all of this data that we can get from social forums to get information about what a given disease state looks like in the real world, not just the people that are visiting you at your lab. Right? And so we've done studies with autism where we even go to Prolific or Amazon Mechanical Turk to get that information that people need. So just to end with, I've shown you that computing can alleviate the negative impact of chronic disorders. I've told you that health research requires accountability at the intersection of science and design, right? My goal is really to show improvement in diabetes foot ulcers, improvement in PTSD recovery. but that in fact to have those kinds of outcomes, you do have to have these systems that are useful, usable, and engageable. And hopefully I've showed you that the future is ripe with opportunities for HCI and AI to improve patients, to improve their engagement, their continuity of care, and their point of care interaction. But also that if you never use AI, you can still do very, very good research. And finally, that GT is a great place to do impactful research, and I hope you'll think about us for some of your academic journey. Thank you very much. Si tienen preguntas, si son tímidos, me las pueden hacer en español, las pueden hacer en inglés, me pueden escribir más tarde, como quieran. Luis.
Mi pregunta sería, toda esta investigación que ha hecho, ¿cómo ha construido su red alrededor para lograr colaborar y obtener estos resultados?
Sí, mi primer, el principio que yo tengo como investigadora es que yo no les puedo pedir algo sin que yo les dé algo. ¿Right? Y por ejemplo, con este trabajo que estamos haciendo en diabetes, estamos trabajando en una casa de gente de mayor edad. ¿Qué hicimos antes? Estuvimos casi un año yendo una vez a la semana, no se crea que es mucho, una vez a la semana, 1 hora, y hacíamos tech support. ¿Con qué necesitan ayuda esta gente? ¿Verdad? Después de ese tiempo, y todavía estamos haciendo el servicio de tech support, pero ponemos nuestros folletos, alguna gente quiere participar en nuestros estudios, otra gente no quiere participar, pero el punto es que siempre tenemos que dejarlos a ellos mejor que cuando empezaron. Porque muchas veces llegan los investigadores, toman datos, esto, lo otro, aquello, y esa comunidad nunca se benefició. Así que para mí es sumamente importante saber que la gente está agarrando algo de mi trabajo. Y con los doctores es lo mismo, porque es muy, imagínense, una de las cosas que le digo a mis estudiantes es que esta gente está salvando vidas. Y yo estoy diseñando cosas bonitas tal vez, pero el tiempo que ellos tienen, y es un apoyo muy grande pensar que esta gente que de verdad está salvando vidas, piensa que lo que estamos haciendo mutuamente es al beneficio, ¿verdad? Te digo, tener este podólogo que está checándonos todo lo que está notando la gente, quieren decir que ellos pueden ver un bienestar a término medio y a término grande. Y ahora, ¿qué es el bienestar? Bueno, Mónica sabe, alguna vez es para esos doctores que ellos estén en los papeles, porque ellos quieren que, es un beneficio que ellos se llevan, ¿verdad? Pero a lo largo puede ser compartir el intellectual property, por estas cosas que se van a hacer, que están a lanzarse, saber que tienen un poquito, aunque siempre les digo que 0% de 10%, 0 de 10% es 0, pero están contentos de todas maneras. Todavía no ganan nada, pero dicen, bueno, tenemos 10% sí, de 0. Bueno, ahí vamos. Pero para mí es ese valor, para mí es saber que yo estoy dando algo, no nada más estoy recibiendo. Gracias, Luz.
Sí, no sé si podrías elaborar un poco sobre la generación sintética de datos con LLMs y cómo se evalúa, ¿no? Porque, por ejemplo, mencionaste lo de Reddit, pero también hay un sesgo en quienes están en Reddit y quienes no.
Sí.
¿no? Entonces, y a veces, a lo mejor estamos, al nosotros evaluamos, decir, si esto me parece real, estamos creando esos estereotipos y sesgos.
Sí. Y yo pienso que es donde tenemos que hacer esas preguntas éticas son muy importantes. Primeramente, en el papel que les dije, lo pueden encontrar en Google Scholar, lo que hicimos es sacar esos prompts con el LLM y luego al final comparar el data y los trends hacia el dato humano. Así que siempre tenemos que comparar a lo que es la data humana, ¿verdad? Y dado el punto que usted dice exactamente, de que si vamos a Reddit, ese es cierto tipo de gente con ciertos valores, con ciertas maneras de ser, pero ese grupo es más auténtico que el grupo que vamos a usar en la red mayor, ¿ve? Así que el punto es que sabemos que hay bias, y la cosa es saber cuánto bias hay para poder así modular este data. O sea que sabemos que hay bias, pero saber cuánta hay. Y lo que nosotros vemos, que yo creo que también ustedes ven, es que mucha gente está simulando y realmente nunca está haciendo esa examinación de ser, ¿cuáles son los límites de esa simulación? ¿En cuánto momento tenemos nosotros que poner un tipo de ratio para empezar a ver cómo podemos quitarle un poquito el bias? Pero tienes razón. Pero el punto de buscar datasets únicos o específicos es para que puedan usar las voces de esta gente, ¿verdad? Y no la amalgamación que es lo que agarramos de ChatGPT o cualquier otro LLM que usen.
Era parecida la pregunta, pero yo creo que elaborándolo mejor, ¿cuál sería uno de los beneficios de tenerte como persona sintética? Mencioné algunos, pero me gustaría como training para...
Sí, efectivamente. El punto es que le dije, ahorita cuando una persona se entrena en ser psicoterapeuta, sí, eso, el punto es que ¿con quién se entrena? Con gente blanca, de medio alto, usualmente mujeres. ¿Entiendes? Ese sistema está super biased. Así que el punto es que nosotros lo que estamos, la propuesta que tenemos es que vamos a modular esa información para poder checar que cuál es la colaboración entre estos propuestos. Y ahora podemos, por ejemplo, simular lo que es una latina de trauma de combate y algunos estigmas que tienen culturales. ¿Ve? O sea que ahora podemos de alguna manera afinar esos, y by the way, ¿verdad? El gold standard of training tienen actores, se llaman virtual patients, que son actores que les dan una, a ver, usted va a ser un paciente con Alzheimer's y le ponen todo lo que es eso, ¿entiende? Pero aquí el beneficio sería cuál es esa interfaz que podemos nosotros o una vez modelar a ese cliente no típico, el hombre con trauma sexual, ¿verdad? Porque hay muchos, y especialmente en el militar, que no lo quiere saber, pero es cierto, ¿right? Pero otra cosa es que usualmente cuando la gente modela estos trastornos, los hacen los trastornos en un espacio, digamos, teórico muy separado. Una persona tiene PTSD, una persona tiene ansiedad. Pero en sí, ¿cómo podemos usar esos modelos para hacer un entrelaz que pueda hacer al psicoterapeuta, al clínico, poder modelar ese espacio para que pueda aprender mejor? Porque en sí, luego se presenta gente que parece que tiene ansiedad, parece que tiene PTSD, y ahora podemos modelar unos clientes más complejos que van a servir para dar mejor entrenamiento.
¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Sí, yo tengo una duda. Primero, muchas felicidades. Me pareció muy interesante la parte del post-traumatic stress disorder.
Sí.
Y entiendo que utilizaron sensores y mucha de la terapia convencional requiere autorreportes de los pacientes. Mi duda es si los sensores son lo suficientemente precisos y también cómo se comparan los niveles de estrés que mide el sensor con los niveles de estrés que reporta el paciente, si están muy alejados, muy cercanos, y también adicional a esto, si detectaron algún caso donde el sensor marcó un nivel de estrés alto, pero el paciente no lo reportó.
Y es exactamente, esas son las intuiciones que tienen los clínicos, ¿verdad? Precisamente en ejemplos que nos han dado, que hay ejemplos donde por fin de hablar con alguien dice, estás haciendo tu terapia todos los días, la estás haciendo muy bien, pero no estás mejorando, ¿verdad? Y al lado de tanto, esa conversación, resulta que dice el señor, no, pues es que siempre hago poquita marihuana antes de hacer para calmarme, ¿entiendes? Y la cosa es que un buen clínico va a poder sacar esa diferencia, pero ¿qué pasa con los novatos? ¿Verdad? Y así que el punto que usted me dice de saber cuál es la diferencia, nosotros estamos usando este app para poder darle unos puntos de conversación al clínico. De nosotros, yo siempre estoy muy segura de que yo no soy, de ese tipo de psicóloga, y lo que más podemos hacer es hacer un sistema que les sirva para ese point of care, que pueda ser patient engagement, porque ahora le digo que tiene que escribir su salud, ¿ok? Me voy a un pedacito de papel y al parque sentarme ahí con mi papel, no es normal, ¿verdad? O no es típico. Así que usando mi app es tal vez más natural. Y vamos a coleccionar esa data exactamente y no esperarnos hasta que vaya al carro a escribir los números. Así que lo que esperamos es que haga que sirva y poder a lo largo con las máquinas poder ver cuál es la diferencia. Sí.
Entonces, estas aplicaciones serían el medio, pero no el fin. El fin siempre sería la evaluación que pueda hacer, es decir, no solo la aplicación, sino también el especialista en cualquiera de los temas que se quieren.
Sí, exactamente. Que nosotros, le digo, yo estoy muy segura de que lo que hago, y para mí es cómo puedo desarrollar un app que pueda streamline, que pueda facilitar ese trayectoria de terapia, sea en PTSD o sea en diabetes. Porque se pone a pensar, tenemos los mismos fines, ¿verdad? El patient engagement. Ahora, o es la paciente o son los grandchildren de la gente para que puedan esa comunidad saber lo que pasa. Pero siempre es ese patient engagement, porque empieza con el paciente. Alright.
¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Ya tienen mi email, si son muy tímidos.
Ok. Bueno, pues acompáñenme a agradecer a Rosa por su plática. Ok, le vamos a entregar un reconocimiento a nombre de CICESE y el reconocimiento dice el Centro de Investigación Científica y Educación Superior del Senado, otorga presente reconocimiento a la doctora Rosa Arriaga por impartir el seminario Diseñando, tecnología a base de teorías psicosociales.
La foto.
Ah, ok.